All right, government students. Today is lesson 4 of Unit 1. This is on American independence and the Revolutionary War. We're going to be looking at these two ideas quite a bit in class, but in order to be able to look at Locke's natural rights theory and how that influences American democracy and what a lot of our core democratic values are, and then Declaration of Independence, we have to kind of have an idea of what gets us to that point. Right? And that's what we're going to be covering here in this particular video. Okay, so the American Revolution, and we find a lot of our origins in a lot of England's history, right? England were English colonies at the start of the Revolutionary War, and we bring a lot of those ideas, a lot of those values, and a lot of that culture over with us, right? So from England's history, you have things like the Magna Carta going all the way back to the 11th century. You have the English Bill of Rights. Many of the individual rights that we really hold dear to come from that, especially things like trial by jury and some of your other rights to speech and religion are starting to come out of the English Bill of Rights. The Mayflower Compact, right, that freedom of religion becomes a major idea that becomes a real critical part of American society, especially around the Revolution and being able to have your own religious beliefs without fear of persecution from the government, because a lot of things were related to that, related to the English Civil War and some of the events after that. The whole idea of social contract theory is also in with that with the Mayflower Compact. But then you also have a huge influence by the Enlightenment. All right, I can't stress enough how much the Enlightenment plays a role in the American Revolution and the foundations of our government. Okay, the ideas are all over the place. John Locke is all over the Declaration of Independence. You start to look at John Locke's writings and the Declaration of Independence, you're going to see a lot of similarities there. Voltaire and his emphasis on individual rights becomes a huge part of it. Montesquieu and his ideas about how to create government really become the foundation for a lot of things that we find in our Constitution. And then Rousseau with his emphasis on social contract theory. So at the start of the Revolution, okay, you have we're colonies. We're colonies of Great Britain. Here you can start to see a lot of that. But for the most part, we govern ourselves. We don't have the British government looking over top. We don't have a lot of decisions made by Parliament that are affecting us. And as a lot of the people who are living there, a lot of the Americans who are living during this time frame, we start to move west into the Ohio River Valley. Okay, so the Ohio River Valley is kind of over here. You can kind of see in some of the shaded area. This becomes kind of the area of conflict because it's two different superpowers at the time that are claiming this particular territory. You have Great Britain and you have France. Okay. This is before the French Revolution. This is before France kind of loses a lot of its power on the world stage. In that sense, it is a major world power at this time. And as they're moving westward into the Ohio River Valley, both sides are disputing it, all right? And we have a war that gets fought over this called the 7 Years' War. Okay, we call it the 7 Years' War because it lasts about 7 years. About 7 years. Probably a lot of you remember this as the French and Indian War. Right, as what we kind of refer to it more in the United States, the French and Indian War, but in Britain they refer to it as the 7 Years' War. Okay? And it's a conflict between France and Great Britain over who's going to control the New World. Okay? Who is going to be the nation that is getting all of these colonies? And eventually, the British win the conflict. Okay? You can see down here in South, Spain has control of Florida. A little bit of dispute over bottom parts of Georgia. Where does that line actually dispute come to? But for the most part, the focus is over here. Britain wins the war. Okay, but one thing you should have taken from world history is that wars are expensive. Okay, wars are not cheap, and you have to pay a lot of money to fight that because you have to not only pay your troops, but you've got to pay to get them over there, to feed them, to clothe them. You have to pay for all the supplies that they're going to use. That's the ammunition, the gunpowder, the medical supplies in order to treat them, the training that goes into it. Wars have always been a very expensive thing. And at the time, it was the idea that a country does not want to carry debt for very long. Okay? That was the kind of the economic belief at the time. And the British win the war, but they have all of these debts now that they have to begin to pay. So King George looks at it and says, well, the war was fought for the colonies, so why don't we have them pay for some of the debts? Okay? That's why we fought in this whole thing in the first place, so these colonies could be able to move westward further. Why don't they take some of those tolls? So Parliament begins to pass some acts to try and recoup some of those taxes, or recoup some of the costs through taxes. The first of them is the Sugar Act. This happens in 1764, just after the war ends, and it taxed the importation of foreign sugar and molasses. Now, this actually didn't really change much because there was already a tax on sugar and molasses in the New World. Okay? The problem was it wasn't ever really enforced. Okay, the people who were in command of the harbors didn't really look that closely, didn't really collect on those taxes on these particular things. But now they're going to start coming down harder. Now you're going to have a lot of the merchants having to pay taxes on those things as they're bringing in. Again, sugar especially is a huge part of the economy in the world as things are coming up from the Caribbean islands and moving into the to the Americas before they get shipped off over to Britain. Okay. Next, the following year, 1765, they passed the Stamp Act. Right, this targets newspapers, legal documents, commercial documents. Okay, all have to get a stamp to be approved by the government before they can do it. And then, again, this is government kind of reaching into the economy a little bit more and just adding little things. This affects the North a lot more than it affects the South. Right, the South's economy was mostly on growing things. The North's economy, especially places around Massachusetts, is all built on commerce. Okay? It's all about shipbuilding and trade. That is what drives that economy. So the northern colonies are feeling this a lot more than the southern colonies. This is why a lot of things started happening in Massachusetts too. Okay? A few years after that, you get the Townshend Acts. Okay, the Townshend Acts are goods taxed on glass, lead, paint, paper, and this isn't going to pay off debts anymore. Okay, the colonists weren't super happy about the previous ones, but you could understand where it's coming from, paying off a debt. But this is now the king trying to get the governors and the judges in America kind of under his control, right? To have loyalty to him rather than to their colonies. And this is an extremely unpopular act in the Americas, so much so there's such an uproar about the Townshend Acts that they end up actually getting repealed later on. And that starts to show maybe a little bit of sign of weakness on the colonists' part towards the British. They can see some weakness in there, and they start to say, well, maybe we should fight some of these other taxes too. Okay? But there's some other events that start to take on. The taxes start it, but there's other things. British troops now get sent to the Americas to try and enforce things. And as soon as the military gets involved, now you're getting a face to the opposition, right? The colonists are now starting to see it's not just taxes anymore. Now this is an occupying force here, okay? And they start to heckle some of these things. Now, this again, I really want to emphasize here too. This is not all the colonists. There were a large number of people in the colonies at the time that really thought we should be loyal to the British. They considered themselves to be British subjects, right? They were not pushing for independence at this point, but you can start to see a lot of the unrest begin to move, okay? Especially after you start to get death involved, right? You have the Boston Massacre in 1770. You have a bunch of British troops who are stationed in the city of Boston, and you have a crowd of people that begin to heckle them over some of these taxes. Again, Boston getting hit hard by the taxes. So we don't really know a whole lot of the details of what happened because witness accounts really vary, especially of who gives the order to fire, right? Here on the right, you can see a painting of it. You can see the colonists with their hands up. They're not armed. They're innocent. They look very innocent. Well, the British troops are lying, pointing their guns and firing into the crowd, trying to make them out. That's probably not how it was. What probably happened is you have a lot of the Americans at the time maybe throwing a snowball, heckling them, yelling out, maybe even them to the fire. The reality is we don't know the exact things that happen. But we do know that the soldiers do fire in the crowd. 3 of them are killed instantly. 2 die later, right? So we have 5 deaths now. But that's not really a massacre, right? This is actually a lot of PR part of Benjamin Franklin, who came up with the Boston Massacre as a way to begin to rally the colonists, different colonies around what happens in Massachusetts towards the idea of independence. Okay, so that's the first thing that kind of sparks it. But then 1773, the Tea Act comes along, and this becomes another really, really unpopular thing that occurs because this isn't, again, not about paying off war debts. This is about bailing out the East India Trading Company. Okay? The East India Trading Company was in dire financial straits at the time, and they needed help, or they were going to go completely under. So they passed the Tea Act in 1773 that taxes all tea. Well, a couple of ships from the East India Company end up, like in Boston Harbor, they say, we're not allowing you to dock. So you have several ships of tea, 3 ships, that are sitting in Boston Harbor for a long period of time. And really the East India Trading Company is losing money over this, right? They're not able to ship goods on those ships. They're literally just sitting there because the harbor won't accept them to dock in order to pay that tax. But then you get members of the Sons of Liberty, okay, who board the ship dressed up as Native Americans, members of the Mohawk tribe, and throw all of that tea, 45 tons worth, into Boston Harbor. Yeah. And claim it as the Boston Tea Party, right? And really, like in modern day times, we would consider this to be an act of domestic terrorism. It would fit that definition. So this leads King George to shut down Boston Harbor. Okay? And again, Boston is built around commerce. So if you shut down the harbor, you're going to have a lot of people who are out of jobs and who are mad at whoever closed the harbor, right? So King George really becomes the front of all of this. All right, a couple years later, that leads to Lexington and Concord as things continue to escalate further and further. Okay? Here, British troops are marching to Concord to seize a hidden cache of weapons as well as a couple of key individuals. This is where Paul Revere's ride is, where he famously didn't say the British are coming, the British are coming, the British are coming. He wouldn't have said that because, again, many of these people consider themselves to be British citizens. So even just saying that doesn't make sense. That's something that gets added in later on in history to the story. And he's not even the only rider. There's several other individuals who ride out and warn individuals. But as the British troops make the long march from Boston to Lexington and then even further on into Concord, they arrive in Concord at this wooden bridge, which you can still go out to Boston and to Concord in the Boston area and see today, where they encounter members of the Massachusetts militia. Right? Again, a militia is basically like a bunch of citizens who gather together in defense of the state if the state is threatened. So the British troops realize, hey, there's no cache of weapons here. The people of interest are gone. There's no real reason for us to be here. So things are beginning to actually de-escalate. The British are about to leave, but then someone fires a shot. And we, just like the Boston Massacre, we don't know who it is. Okay? It could have been one of the maybe a accidental firing from a British regular, but they're well-trained soldiers. That probably doesn't happen. Could be maybe a nervous militiaman who fires off a shot. Maybe it was somebody else. Maybe it was somebody behind a grassy knoll or something like that fires it off. But the reality is you have a conflict that occurs, a small skirmish, and initially the British win. They're better trained, they're better equipped, they're one of the best armies in the entire world at the time. But they still have, right, they're in Concord now, they still have the long march all the way back to Boston. And what happens as they're going back is you have additional Minutemen. Right, the idea is that they're more militiamen who could show up at a minute's notice, are able to show up and do basically kind of like hit and run tactics on this group of British soldiers who are marching back to Boston. And As a result of that, the British have high casualties, and it ends up becoming really kind of the first colonial victory. Okay? And after this really becomes the point where other colonies are starting to see what's happening in Massachusetts and saying it's not going to be long before this is us, and it becomes a rallying cry, and we start to really seriously consider independence, right? And that is going to occur with the First Continental Congress that gets together and eventually drafts the Declaration of Independence under Thomas Jefferson. John Adams and Ben Franklin all work together on that project. Jefferson gets credit for writing most of it. And then eventually us declaring independence in July of 1776. Okay? So that is everything that you need to know for this lesson, and we'll kind of discuss the Declaration of Independence as well as a lot of the other core democratic values that we start to see in the Declaration in other parts of our government in class. So I'll see you then.